December 17, 1944, Wereth, Belgium. In the frozen backcountry of the Ardennes, as the Battle of the Bulge reached its most chaotic hours, 11 American soldiers disappeared from the battlefield without a report, without witnesses, and without official explanation. They were not lost in combat. They were not overrun during a retreat. They were captured alive by advancing German Waffen-SS units and removed from the normal machinery of war. Hours later, their bodies would lie in a snow-covered field, positioned close together, evidence showing they had been held, interrogated, and deliberately executed. Several had injuries consistent with prolonged abuse before death. What made this incident different, what ensured it would vanish from wartime records for decades, was not the absence of evidence, but the identity of the victims. They were African American U.S. soldiers serving in a segregated army, operating in a war that claimed to be fought for freedom. Their deaths would not trigger trials, headlines, or immediate investigation. Instead, they would be quietly filed away, misclassified, and forgotten. To understand how American soldiers could be treated this way in Europe in 1944, the story must begin far from Belgium, inside the structure of the U.S. Army itself. By the time American forces returned to Europe in force in 1944, the United States Army was the largest military institution in the nation's history, and one of the most rigidly segregated. African American soldiers served in uniform across every theater of the war, but they did so inside a system that officially treated them as a problem to be managed rather than an asset to be trusted. The War Department classified black troops as suitable primarily for labor, supply, and support roles. Combat assignments were limited, closely controlled, and often temporary, driven more by emergency manpower shortages than by doctrine. By mid-1944, over 1 million African Americans were serving in the U.S. Armed Forces. Most were assigned to quartermaster units, engineer battalions, transportation companies, and ammunition depots. These units moved supplies, repaired roads, built bridges, buried the dead, and recovered wreckage under fire. Their work kept the Allied advance moving, but it rarely brought recognition. Promotions were slow. Equipment was often inferior. White officers frequently rotated in and out, while black soldiers remained fixed in place, treated as interchangeable labor. Despite this, black troops performed effectively wherever they were deployed. Units like the 761st Tank Battalion, the 92nd Infantry Division, and the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion proved their combat value under fire. But success did not dismantle segregation. It intensified scrutiny. Failures were generalized. Successes were treated as exceptions. In the European theater, racial policy followed American law, not Allied law. Jim Crow crossed the Atlantic. Military police enforced segregation in camps, mess halls, and recreational facilities. German prisoners of war were sometimes treated with more procedural consistency than black American soldiers. This contradiction was not lost on Allied observers or on the enemy. As 1944 progressed, the U.S. Army faced a growing manpower crisis. Casualties mounted in Normandy, France, and the Low Countries. Replacement pipelines lagged. Commanders began attaching black units to white formations in provisional roles, especially artillery, engineering, and logistics. These ad hoc assignments placed black soldiers closer to the front lines than policy ever intended, often without adequate protection, coordination, or contingency planning. It was within this strained, improvised system that the men who would later die near Wereth were serving, soldiers operating forward of expectations, inside an army still uncertain how much it trusted them, on the eve of Germany's last major offensive. That uncertainty would soon collide with a battlefield where rules were already unraveling. By early December 1944, Allied commanders believed the war in Western Europe was nearing its final phase. Paris had been liberated. The German army was retreating toward its borders. Intelligence assessments described the Ardennes forest as a quiet sector, rugged, wooded, and unsuitable for a major offensive. American units assigned to the region were often inexperienced, exhausted, or recently rotated in to recover. It was here, in this perceived backwater, that Adolf Hitler chose to strike. Before dawn on December 16, 1944, more than 200,000 German troops surged through the Ardennes in a surprise counteroffensive aimed at splitting Allied lines and capturing the port of Antwerp. The attack shattered thinly held American positions. Communications failed. Units became isolated. Roads clogged with retreating vehicles and refugees. In the confusion, command structures fractured, and individual soldiers were often left to navigate the battlefield alone. Among the units caught in the opening hours was the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, a predominantly African American unit attached to the U.S. 106th Infantry Division. Stationed near the German border, the battalion was tasked with providing artillery support, not frontline defense. When German armor broke through, many gun crews were forced to abandon their positions. Small groups attempted to escape westward on foot, moving through forests and farm roads, trying to avoid capture. German forces advancing through the region included elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, a formation known for ideological commitment, battlefield brutality, and disregard for the laws governing prisoners of war. Within hours of the offensive, Waffen-SS units were capturing American soldiers across the Ardennes. In several documented cases, those captures ended in execution rather than imprisonment. For African American soldiers, the danger was compounded. Nazi racial ideology viewed black troops not as legitimate combatants, but as subhuman enemies. This belief was not theoretical. It had been reinforced through propaganda, indoctrination, and previous encounters with colonial forces in earlier campaigns. On December 17, as the German advance deepened, 11 soldiers from the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion became separated from larger American formations near the village of Wereth. They were no longer protected by unit cohesion, command oversight, or the expectation of standard prisoner treatment. They were simply American soldiers, isolated behind enemy lines, at the mercy of an advancing force that did not recognize them as entitled to survive. December 17, 1944, Wereth, Belgium. The snow was deep, the wind cutting through layers of uniform and coat. 11 African American soldiers, men of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, had been captured by elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division. They were isolated, exhausted, and unarmed. The standard procedures of the Geneva Conventions, the protocols for taking prisoners, and the structure of the U.S. Army that guaranteed processing, recording, and eventual detention did not apply. These men were seen as expendable, their very identity marking them for a different fate. Witness statements collected later revealed that they were ordered from their hiding points to a nearby field. There were no witnesses to the initial capture. Only fragments of testimony from villagers and soldiers passing the area would later piece together the sequence. The soldiers were made to dig holes in frozen earth, an act that in other circumstances might have been routine military labor. Here, the labor was a prelude to death. The shovels bit into the hard ground, the scrape echoing in the silent Ardennes night. The psychological weight was immense. These men were trained artillerymen, soldiers who had endured years of training, movement across Europe, and the unpredictability of combat. Yet here, stripped of weapons and separated from their units, they faced a controlled, deliberate threat far different from the randomness of battle, a calculated execution under orders. The German soldiers conducting the operation were part of a formation notorious for ruthlessness and ideological fanaticism. They understood that these captives were Black Americans. That fact alone dictated the absence of formal prisoner of war treatment. Orders, as recorded in post-war investigations, emphasized efficiency over legality. There would be no trial, no documentation, no recourse. The digging concluded. The holes were shallow, hastily prepared. One by one, the men were forced into the ground they had just disturbed. Eyewitness accounts from the surrounding village later described movement, shouting, and then silence. A silence broken only by the wind through the pine trees. By dawn, 11 bodies lay in the snow, each in the grave they had dug themselves. The atrocity at Wereth was not an isolated moment of battlefield cruelty. It was the intersection of racial ideology, institutional neglect, and the chaos of war. For decades, this event remained unacknowledged, filed under unidentified casualties in military records. The discovery came weeks later. Allied forces advancing through the Ardennes stumbled upon the bodies of the 11 soldiers near Wereth. The snow had partially melted, preserving some of the evidence of what had occurred: shallow graves, remnants of uniforms, and the abandoned shovels. For the first time, it became clear that these were not random casualties of war. These were deliberate killings, American soldiers targeted for their race, executed by enemy combatants who violated the laws of war. Military investigators documented the scene, but the broader response was muted. The U.S. Army was still reeling from the chaos of the Ardennes offensive, and racial prejudices within the military hierarchy meant that black casualties often received less attention than their white counterparts. The names of these men, the Wereth 11, were recorded, but official recognition lagged by decades. Newspapers in 1944 published brief casualty lists. There was no headline story, no feature account of their deaths. The massacre also revealed the limits of battlefield control during the Bulge. The Americans' front lines were fluid, units were cut off, and the fog of war allowed atrocities that might otherwise have been prevented. The Wereth killings occurred in a pocket of chaos where the normal rules of military engagement no longer applied. For the 11 men, escape was impossible, and surrender was a sentence. Even within the German ranks, this event reflected the lethal ideology of the Waffen-SS. African American soldiers were considered unworthy of POW status, a designation rooted in Nazi racial doctrine. The Wereth killings were not an anomaly in ideology. They were the logical outcome of a system that dehumanized black soldiers while glorifying the notion of racial superiority in combat. The field remained empty, the graves shallow, and the silence heavy. The Ardennes winter pressed on, covering evidence in snowstorms, leaving behind a historical void. The atrocity at Wereth would remain largely unknown for decades, an obscured truth within the broader narrative of the Battle of the Bulge. This hidden crime would only be fully confronted years later, when historians, families, and survivors' testimonies began to reclaim the Wereth 11 from obscurity. Its legacy is not only one of loss, but also a reflection on the failures of an army and a nation to protect all of its soldiers equally. The Wereth 11 were lost in the chaos of the Ardennes, their deaths recorded only as battle casualties. Immediate recognition never came. Families received letters, but the truth, that 11 African American soldiers had been captured, forced to dig their own graves, and executed, was largely ignored. Within the segregated U.S. Army, racial prejudice compounded wartime confusion, leaving these men invisible in official records while atrocities against white soldiers like Malmedy prompted investigations and trials. Decades passed before their story resurfaced. Local villagers' testimonies, archival research, and historian efforts reconstructed the events, culminating in the 1994 memorial in Wereth. 11 black granite pillars etched with their names, standing as a stark symbol of sacrifice, injustice, and delayed recognition. Descendants and scholars worked to ensure the soldiers were remembered not merely as victims, but as Americans who served with honor under impossible conditions. The massacre exposed both the brutality of war and the systemic failures of the U.S. military. Soldiers targeted for their race, left unprotected and nearly erased from history. Yet, in memory, commemoration, and scholarship, the Wereth 11 claim their place in history, not as forgotten casualties, but as witnesses to courage, injustice, and the enduring fight for recognition. The story of the Wereth 11 is a harsh reminder that heroism alone does not guarantee justice. These men served their country with courage, navigating the front lines of one of the bloodiest battles in history, only to be betrayed by both the enemy and the institutions meant to protect them. Their deaths expose the uncomfortable truth of World War II. Freedom and democracy were ideals Americans fought for abroad, but not always upheld for all soldiers equally. Yet there is a quiet resilience in this history. The eventual recognition of the Wereth 11, the memorial in Belgium, the research uncovering their story, and the descendants who honor their names, transforms tragedy into testimony. It is a story that demands acknowledgement, forcing us to confront the costs of prejudice, the gaps in historical memory, and the sacrifices of those who were once invisible. In remembering the Wereth 11, we confront a deeper truth. The battlefield does not only test weapons or strategy, it tests the values of a nation and the humanity of those who fight. Their legacy endures not simply in death, but in the lessons they leave behind, about courage under impossible circumstances, about the consequences of institutional failure, and about the enduring need to honor every life equally in the pages of history. Even amid snow, silence, and injustice, their service speaks louder than the decades of neglect, a voice that refuses to be forgotten.